morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be back here in the moot court. This is where I started my journey as a lawyer many years ago, and so it's very nice to be back here at McGill. Today I'm going to talk to you briefly about this report, Tax Abuses, Poverty and Human Rights, which is a publication of the International Bar Association's Human Rights Institute. And I had the good fortune of being the rapporteur of this particular task force, and Shirley Llyod here is the mastermind behind the project, and so we'll get to hear from her as well. It's a fairly meaty report. It's a couple hundred pages long. It could have been a couple thousand pages long, but in essence, the messages that I'm going to hit can be relatively succinct, and I think I'm going to try and go quickly over this in order to have discussion, because there's a lot behind each of the sort of key findings and conclusions. There's a lot of debate and discussion, and I'd rather have that come out through our conversation with the audience. So this, the task force report was published in October of 2013 at the last IBA annual conference in Boston. And I think what was very interesting, the project took place over a couple of years of research and consultation. And at the beginning, if you've done a Google search around tax and human rights issues, and I did this search and I looked at everything I could put my hands on, I found 2 or 3 very, very skinny reports. And by the end of our process, there is a lot of reports out there, there's a lot of momentum, and this conference continues that momentum. So I think it's a really interesting moment where these very important concepts of tax and human rights are being linked together. The sort of initial reaction to our report has been that this analysis has been very much welcome, but there is a lot of further research and analysis needed. I think we've managed to, in this, set a sort of framework for analyzing some of the issues, but the great expression, the devil is in the details on this. Really, there is a need for further plunging into how this plays out in specific jurisdictions and with respect to specific human rights issues and specific tax abusive schemes. The background to the IBA Human Rights Institute's task force really comes from a resolution that linked extreme poverty with violations of human rights. So there's kind of behind our research and consultations an impetus that made us focus really on where these issues play out in terms of developing countries and the most poor, where these issues really can be felt in quite extreme terms. The task force was created with a bunch of international legal experts. Stephen Cohen is somewhere around here. He was one of the members of the task force, and Thomas Bobby was the chair of the task force. And we conducted consultations in the Southern African region, in Latin America, and we also did consultations in Jersey to try and get a sense of what goes on in one quote-unquote secrecy or jurisdiction or tax haven. We interviewed many different stakeholder groups, tax lawyers, big representatives of multinational corporations, NGOs, tax authorities, and so on and so forth. So we got a broad range of views. And then we tried to put it together in this publication. As I said, it was published last October, and now we're in a phase where we're doing follow-up activities at this stage, primarily in events like this, trying to generate further discussion and generate further ideas for research and action. In terms of the key findings of the task force, to put it in a nutshell, tax abuses deprive governments of the resources required to give effect to economic, social, and cultural rights, and to create and strengthen the institutions that uphold civil and political rights. So tax abuses have an impact on the full spectrum of human rights. And sort of put another way, the actions that states undertake to encourage or facilitate tax abuses or deliberately frustrate the efforts of other states to counter tax abuses could constitute a violation of their international human rights obligations. And I think, Ignacio, you gave a very good presentation about some of the legal foundations for that in terms of the commentaries on the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights and some of the soft law principles that are now kind of creating a sufficient legal framework to have a human rights analysis of these issues. I think also, though Ignacio pointed out, that international human rights covenants to date have not explicitly addressed the issue of taxes. It's, I think, quite implicit in them, but it's not explicit. And also, on the other hand, international tax treaties, tax statutes don't tend to make the explicit link with human rights either. So there's something that, in putting these together, that I think for the future that we need to think about is how do you make this more explicit in terms of a statutory or treaty basis. In our consultations, to take maybe a step back, tax abuses, we settled on this term with David here was one of the people we consulted with, and he gave us, I think, a very good copy that we settled upon the term tax abuses to deliberately sidestep the issue of tax evasion versus tax avoidance, because that could have been a 6-volume treatise in and of itself. And I think what we're trying to settle upon is that tax evasion, tax avoidance, and all the gray areas in between, there are matters of law, there are matters of policy, there are matters of justice, and there are also matters of the ability to enforce these things. I don't think we have the scope to get into finding answers to all those questions, but the idea of tax abuse it's a bit like when people talk about pornography. You can't really define it, but you kind of know it when you see it. There's a kind of a smell test to it. And through our consultations, what we've been, particularly in developing countries where we have the focus on extreme poverty, we settled on 4 broad types of transactions or schemes that are of greatest concern in terms of tax abuses. And these were transfer pricing and intergroup cross-border transactions. And here the concern is really the magnitude of this. And there are reports that say that this is the greatest amount of cross-border financial flows happens within corporations, and this goes on without a great amount of scrutiny, particularly for developing countries who may not have the capacity to regulate and enforce transfer pricing. The negotiation of tax holidays and incentives is also a great area of concern in developing countries, and here it's questions of inequality of bargaining power between state and multinational companies. It's the issue of potential corruption and so on. A subset of that is the taxation of natural resources, and in many countries in Latin America and Africa, we heard about how the tax regime is doing a disservice to people who have very few paths out of poverty in terms of economic development, and the multinational companies are coming in and exploiting their primary resources and not paying an adequate share of tax or benefits or royalties. And finally, the use of offshore investment accounts was another area of concern in terms of potential tax abuses. And this is an interesting one because there's corporate behavior in there, but there's also the behavior of wealthy individuals who have offshore investment accounts, and a question about how does the international human rights regime apply or not to individuals. And then the final area that we looked at in great detail is around secrecy jurisdictions and the roles that these play in facilitating various forms of tax abuses. So I've been given a little sign there, so I'm going to go more quickly. We had three main conclusions in our report. The first one is probably quite basic, but it's worth restating. It's that states have obligations to counter tax abuses at the domestic and international level, including through cooperation in multinational institutions. Both in terms of the relationship between the state and the citizen is very fundamental, both for taxation and for human rights. And that there's a need to reaffirm the role of the state in both protecting human rights as well as in setting fair tax policies and having the ability to enforce tax laws. The second conclusion was that business enterprises have a responsibility to avoid negative impacts on human rights caused by tax abuses. All business enterprises, including the corporate legal advisors and bankers, should exercise due diligence on potential negative impacts of their operations, and this includes their tax planning strategies. And as we saw through the course of our research, some of the great media attention that companies like Starbucks and others got, that tax abuse is poised to become an important issue for businesses in terms of their corporate social responsibility, reputational risk, and human rights policies. Third conclusion is that the legal profession has an important role in assisting states and businesses in confronting the negative impacts of tax abuse on human rights. Here there are some very tricky questions around lawyers needing to balance their obligation to defend their clients' interests with the underlying role of taxation in society. And I think the big thing is there's a need for collective action at the level of law societies as a matter of practice, to set guidelines on and training on how tax lawyers and others can deal with human rights issues that are related to tax practice. So just in conclusion, this publication, as I said at the beginning, there were very few other reports on this. Now there seems to be an area that is really gaining momentum. I'm very heartened to hear other people talking about similar concepts, similar forms of analysis about how human rights can bring a certain value added to this conversation at a global policy level. And we really welcome this opportunity here at McGill to take the conversation further. So thank you very much.